Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is TVP World. You're watching World News Tonight. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee. Protests continue in Georgia as the ruling Georgian Dream party installs a loyalist president, sparking widespread criticism. More on this in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at the latest headlines. Outrage continue as Georgian government halts accession negotiations with the European Union. Russia-linked hackers accused of interfering in Polish elections with disinformation campaigns. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz faces political setback after losing a no-confidence vote in the parliament. While peaceful pro-democracy protests persist in Tbilisi, authorities have intensified measures aimed at discouraging public participation. Strict regulations are being imposed on citizens in an effort to suppress dissent. Our correspondent, Olaf, has more on the situation in Georgia.
Another day of the protests here in Tbilisi continues. This comes as, well, finally the Christmas tree here in front of the parliament has been lit, although protesters were able to thwart the official ceremony to do so. However, today is also the last day of President Georgieville's presidency. She is now supposed to step down. She says she will not step down. What happens tomorrow remains to be seen. But as far as the Georgian Dream party is concerned, another way that they have cracked down on these protests, and that is the increase of administrative fines and penalties for protesters taking part in these marches and demonstrations in front of the parliament. So just to give you an idea of some of the new provisions, an individual may be detained for the reason of preventing a repeated administrative offense, even though he or she has not committed a new offense. So this gives police the power to arbitrarily arrest people that they suspect could engage in some kind of provocative or illegal behavior. Now also, any partial or full blocking of motor traffic will entail a fine of 5,000 lire or more here in the capital. That is about almost $2,000. That's a huge fine for those attempting to block traffic. Now, we've seen this in these marches in the preceding days, that several marches started in various points in the city, and indeed they did choke traffic, grinding the city to a halt. So this will be quite a significant fine for those people. Now, the use of fireworks at rallies or demonstrations will be punished up to 5 years in prison. This is a very hefty sentence, if you will, for those that are using fireworks. Even if you use a laser beam, we've seen a lot of laser beams pointed at police officers that were standing on the sides of the parliament. You could be fined up to $600 for such an offense. Now also for those protesters who cover their face or use masks, that will also be punished by a fine of around $650. Of course, if people can't pay these fines, they will face jail time. And so it seems that these new provisions that the government has rolled out is having an effect on these demonstrations. There's much less people in the streets now than there was just a few days ago, and of course, very peaceful protests. However, many people telling us that they will continue to show up here night after night until they get new elections, until all of the 500 plus people who've been detained in these protests have been released. But of course, those new elections are the most important thing for Georgians who want free and fair elections. Reporting from Tbilisi, Olaf, TVP World.
Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has vowed to combat foreign interference in Poland's democratic processes, accusing Russia-linked hackers of promoting pro-law and justice content during last year's elections. Tusk says that we will not tolerate such attacks. Our chief political correspondent, Aaron Diamond, has the details.
In the months before voters returned Donald Tusk as Poland's Prime Minister, it appears an attack was taking place on the country's political system.
Every hour, every day, we have information about our neighbours. I'm thinking mainly of Minsk, Moscow, that various aggressive actions can indeed be expected there. Poland will be safe when we know that no one has the chance to interfere in our internal affairs.
According to an investigation by the prosecutor's office, which was first obtained by Gazeta Wyborcza, professional hackers likely working for Russian intelligence attempted to rally support for the far-right Conservative Law and Justice Party, who are now in opposition, before the 2023 general election. They sent 187,000 election propaganda texts, planned 600,000 more, and took control of screens in 20 shopping malls around the country, all by gaining access to companies managing advertising and info kiosks.
The Prime Minister has asked the Commission of Special Services to deal with the issue of election security in Poland against foreign interference. The conclusions will be implemented in the activities of the Special Services.
The Ministry of Justice and Prosecutor's Office were keeping tight-lipped on the findings today, refusing to comment to TVP World. But some of the hacked messages reportedly highlighted a promise that Law and Justice would organise funerals for pensioners for free, which the party had never committed to.
The expression hybrid war is quite relevant here, I suppose, and the suspect is what we call a usual suspect. The methods used to undermine the integrity of the Polish elections a year ago very much remind, indeed, those methods used by the Russian intelligence.
It comes as Poland ramps up hybrid war defences against Russia and Belarus, including temporarily suspending the right to asylum and ensuring a veto power over any proposed acquisition of private TV broadcasters TVN and Polsat that are deemed dangerous to national interests.
We will not allow hostile countries to interfere in a brazen way, as happened in Romania or recently in Moldova or in many other places, in our daily lives, in our economy or in electoral processes and our democracy.
In an exclusive interview with TVP World this month, Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski delivered a blunt warning to Russia.
We know what you're doing. We have proof that you're doing it. Stop doing it. And if you don't, we'll take further action.
On the orders of Prime Minister Tusk, a commission was launched in May to specifically investigate Russian and Belarusian influence on Poland's internal security and interests. And in Brussels, new NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte says the issue is more widespread.
Over the past years, Russia and also China have tried to destabilize our nations with acts of sabotage, cyber attacks and energy blackmail to intimidate us. None of these actions will deter us from supporting Ukraine or making our own defences stronger.
From election interference in Romania to Moldova, Georgia to Poland, Central Eastern Europe is fighting to ensure the region does not become Russia's disinformation playground.
Poland's Minister for European Union Affairs has underscored the importance of achieving full independence from Russian energy supplies. At a press briefing, he announced that former Prime Minister Jerzy Buzek will serve as an energy security advisor as Poland prepares to assume the EU Council presidency on January 1st.
We are aiming for Europe to become fully independent from dangerous energy suppliers, and by that I mean mainly Russia. I am pleased to announce that former Prime Minister Jerzy Buzek will lead a team of advisors that will support us during this presidency, especially when it comes to energy security matters.
It is also thanks to the Polish position that we have kept over the years that we have been slowly disassociating ourselves from the import of fossil fuels from Russia. I hope we can completely cut this dependency off as soon as possible.
Hungary and Slovakia have vetoed stronger sanctions on Georgia, leaving the EU to impose limited measures such as restrictions on visa-free travel for Georgian diplomats. This decision comes as protests in Tbilisi enter their third week. Paweł Czewskowski reports.
This was Kaja Kallas's first statement as the newly appointed EU Foreign Affairs representative. And sanctions against Georgia were to be high on the agenda on Monday. However, the announcement concerning the current situation in Tbilisi was very brief.
Today, we agreed the need to hold the visa-free regime for diplomatic passport holders, and Commission will make a proposal already this year.
The EU's attempt to sanction Georgia comes as the country's ruling party, the Georgian Dream, decided to suspend EU membership talks until 2028. This decision sparked pro-EU protests, which were met with a violent crackdown by the government. These actions prompted calls for EU sanctions against the responsible Georgian individuals.
EU should, without any further delay, announce sanctions, personal sanctions on the political leadership and civil servants who are recorded to be violating those democratic and human rights principles for years now.
But in order to impose these sanctions, a unanimous vote is needed, and that was not achieved on Monday.
You know, with sanctions, we need 27 on board. So therefore, we are unfortunately not there.
And the EU is not there because the sanctions were vetoed by two countries, Hungary and Slovakia.
Some European countries have announced they are going to introduce sanctions individually. In Poland, this has not been discussed yet. We'll make decisions after my return.
But on Monday, the Council managed to pass the 15th package of sanctions against Russia, which include, among others, 52 third-country ships transporting oil from Moscow. These vessels are part of the so-called Shadow Fleet, which has been a key financial lifeline for Russia's war effort, dodging sanctions on Russian energy exports. The latest sanction package also includes 84 new individuals and entities, including 7 from China, a country from which Moscow gets most of its foreign technology. These are the first sanctions on the country to include travel bans and asset freezes, a move that is to show Beijing that, quote, China cannot fuel war in Europe and get away with it.
For the first time, Ukrainian forces have reportedly encountered North Korean troops fighting alongside Russian units in the Kursk region. We now go live to Kyiv, where our Ukraine correspondent Oz Karaji has the latest. Good evening, Oz. What can you tell us about the presence of North Korean soldiers on the battlefield in the Ukrainian-occupied Russia?
Well, this was reported by the Ukrainian government that North Korean troops had engaged with the Ukrainian armed forces for the first time in the occupied parts of the Kursk region occupied by Ukraine. Now, Kyiv reported that they saw engagement across several villages in the Kursk region, and there was footage on FPV drones showing the engagements, and Kyiv has reported at least 30 North Korean troops have been killed in these engagements. Now, Zelensky also spoke about this on Monday. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Russia drew one more country into this war to the fullest extent. If this is not considered to be an escalation, then what is the escalation that so many people are talking about? It is Putin who is widening and prolonging this war. It is him who is pushing back against any future peace agreement. He wants to add more problems for the world in Asia. That's why Russians are teaching modern war to North Korea.
Zelensky has also recently put out another statement saying there is no reason for Koreans to die in this war. The only reason is Putin's madness, which has gripped Russia and is fueling this war. We will continue to defend our positions. Now, Ukraine believes there is as many as 11,000 North Korean troops currently in Russia. And the fear in Kyiv is that many more of those troops will see action against Ukrainian armed forces in the weeks to come.
All right, thank you, Oz. Appreciate the update, and please do stay safe. Appreciate it. Environmental activists are raising alarms about Russia's aging shadow fleet, warning of catastrophic risk in the Baltic Sea. The concerns follow a tanker spill and damage to another vessel during the storms in the Kerch Strait. John Todd has more.
Crew of the Russian Volga-Neft 239 look on in horror as the bow of their ship breaks off in heavy seas, releasing thousands of tons of oil products. The same storm in the Kerch Strait between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov damaged the Volga-Neft 212. Environmentalists say this should be a wake-up call for countries neighbouring the Baltic Sea, where some 200 ageing Russian vessels have been used to evade sanctions.
The risk is immense, and it's actually an ongoing problem, and those vessels are passing through the Baltic as we speak, and so it's actually like happening constantly all the time.
Greenpeace found that in 2023, around 1,000 tanker journeys were made westward from Russia. That's 2 to 3 a day. The so-called shadow fleet evades Western sanctions and a $60 a barrel price cap through opaque ownership and registration under flags where checks are less stringent. The tankers are often ill-insured, if at all, and generally 2 to 3 times older than their normal working life.
The average age of those tankers is in between, they're gradually, the number of them is increasing, so there's more and more of them, but it's around 20 years, which it's an age when many ships of this kind are scrapped, and so they should be written off from service.
Questions over the ship's insurance means Baltic countries could be left footing the bill for a big oil spill. The Research Centre for Energy and Clean Air estimates that bill could cost from 100 million to 1.6 billion euros.
If something happens, we are not sure about oil spill and who will pay and who will pay for cleanup. Because because we don't know anything about Russian insuring companies.
The EU and Baltic states are looking to hobble the fleet and hit the Kremlin's war chest. The answer may lie partly in further sanctions.
With the new EU decision to blacklist several dozen oil and gas tankers, that's going to cut away billions of illicit fossil fuel sales from Moscow.
The EU recently placed restrictions on some 50 of these tankers following a US lead that saw blacklisted ships transport some 90% less oil after being sanctioned. Activists say Russia's dark fleet poses a major threat while it remains operational.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been ousted in a no-confidence vote, triggering snap elections. Polls indicate a likely victory for the opposition Christian Democrats, who are poised to form the next government. Krzysztof Panik reports.
The Bundestag put the final nail in Olaf Scholz's political career, refusing to grant his now minority government a motion of confidence. Only 207 out of 733 MPs voted for the current administration to stay in power. The move was expected by the Chancellor, who called the vote himself.
After an election, all Democrats must be prepared to work together for the good of the country, to build bridges and forge compromises. This is not possible without moral maturity, decency and seriousness, but only with a sense of responsibility for our entire country, for all citizens.
The coalition government, composed of Scholz's Social Democrats, the Greens and the liberal FDP, collapsed in November. The FDP's disapproval of administration's spending policy led it to exit the coalition, paving the way for early elections. Opinion polls predict a win for the opposition Christian Democratic Union in the upcoming vote, although not by a wide enough margin for it to govern alone. All three coalition parties are projected to lose seats.
In this situation, the most probable remains either so-called Grand Coalition, so coalition between the Christian Democrats and the SPD, however, without the participation of Olaf Scholz and his supporters, or least probable option, a coalition between the CDU, CSU and the Greens.
For the last 3 years, the Christian Democrats have been led by Friedrich Merz, who revamped the party's platform. To combat Germany's economic stagnation, he proposes tax cuts. He has also put a greater focus on combating illegal immigration.
Generally speaking, moved towards right, so it was like coming back to the CDU came back to its Christian democratic conservative roots, so to speak, both in terms of economical policy as well as when it comes to approach to the worldview. And
Merz has also been a vocal supporter of Ukraine, proposing deliveries of long-range missiles to Kyiv.
Our position is clear, as is that of my parliamentary group. We want to enable your army to reach military bases in Russia, not the civilian population, not the infrastructure, but to reach the military targets from which your country is being attacked.
The anti-immigration Alternative for Germany party is expected to double its seats, although it is unlikely to enter the coalition.
This party is stigmatized, it's isolated, it is an outcast, basically, in German politics, and no other party wants to coalesce with it, wants to be an ally of this party.
Scholz proposed that the snap elections take place on February the 23rd. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier holds the final say on the date, having until December 27th to make the decision.
The European Union's latest sanctions have not only targeted Russia's shadow fleet and key individuals facilitating its war efforts, but also extended to Chinese entities for the first time, marking a shift in how the EU approaches sanctions on foreign actors aiding Moscow. Meanwhile, the bloc faces internal discord over proposed sanctions on Georgia amid its crackdown on pro-European protests. What do these developments mean for global geopolitics and EU unity? Joining us today on TVP World to discuss these is Sergei Vakulenko, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good afternoon.
So, can you help us understand how significant is the inclusion of Chinese entity in the latest pack of sanctions? And, well, what does this signal about the current state of EU-China relations?
That's EU is following the US steed. It realizes that it's not enough to sanction Russian entities alone, that to make sanctions biting, EU really has to address the counterparties that Russia is dealing with. Still, European sanctions mechanisms are much weaker than the American ones because American sanctions actually make it a crime in many circumstances for the foreign parties to violate sanctions, even if a transaction happens offshore quite far from the US soil. That's not the case for Europe, but EU is showing a resolve that even third country parties are not immune from this sanctions mechanism. So it's just a reality. Otherwise, these sanctions would be absolutely toothless. What is EU trying to do at the moment is to add some tooth to it.
Right. Perhaps this is high time to close up some of these loopholes that Russians have been abusing. Well, but given the economic challenges facing EU nations like Germany, for example, which rely on trade with China, is there actually enough political will to fully enforce these sanctions?
It's often a difficult choice. It's almost impossible to create sanctions that would be bitter and biting for the other side without imposing costs on yourselves. Just any kind of warfare, economic warfare, has costs for both parties. So it's really a choice how much a country is prepared to pay for its ethical and political ideals, for its military goals, and how much economic damage to suffer. Of course, for Germany and China, German-Chinese relationship, the concern is whether there will be any backlash from Chinese side for sanctioning Chinese companies. So far, of course, these are small and obscure Chinese companies, and so far China hasn't shown any enthusiasm for striking back. So far it's a bit safe. Whether it's going to expand if, for example, Germany would start to sanction Chinese refiners that buy Russian oil, this is an open question, but we're not there yet.
Right, and like you mentioned earlier, for these sanctions to actually have some bite, we do need to make sure that it is properly enforced and there's no way around it. Now, talking about the shadow fleet, we do know that it has been a tactic for Russia to evade sanctions for years. Why is the EU acting decisively against it only now?
there were hopes that the sanctions would work without this explicit listing of the ships. But to be honest, this listing of the ships doesn't add much to the sanctions, because even before, these ships were prohibited from obtaining services in European ports. And now, well, these ships can go around Europe without stopping by a European port for refueling, bunkering as it's called, or getting some foodstuffs from it. So it is an inconvenience, but not really a biting sanction.
Right,
it's a step in a strong direction, but not more than that, just a step.
And well, we're looking at the first time that countries that are not just Russia being sanctioned. We're seeing those involved like China, North Korea. What does this message, what is the EU sending message to the global community?
EU is clearly trying to implement what's called economic statecraft, to add sanctions to its arsenal. EU barely had any sanction policies until 2022 and is now trying to catch up with the US. EU is trying to make its sanctions policy matter and work, and that's what the EU is trying to do. But there is a lot of work to do. US have been honing their sanctions policies for more than 50 years. US have strong execution bodies that look at sanctions enforcement. EU still has to build this thing. And also in the European Union, much of the enforcement is done on national levels. And whatever decisions are made at the level of the Union, the enforcement is still done by the national governments.
Right.
And there, of course, the enforcement is rather patchy.
I would like to also focus on a situation in Georgia. Speaking of sanctions, we do know that the sanctions proposed by Kaja Kallas targeting the Georgian government officials have been vetoed today by Hungary and Slovakia. Is there anything else the European Union or Europe can do to help Georgia in their aspirations for the EU and their struggle for freedom?
I guess there is an argument in Europe between various members of the Union how much of political activism Union should pursue. And indeed, well, there are differences of opinions. Well, there are conservative countries like Slovakia and Hungary thinking that Europe should mind its own business and let the other countries to decide which path they would like to follow, while other countries think that Georgia is a battleground between European ideals and Russian influence. So it's really difficult. It's on country-by-country basis. And there are countries in Europe, like Baltic countries, that have applied these sanctions on the country level. So probably few things could be done on country-by-country basis.
Now, the current pro-European president, Saakashvili, is saying that she will not resign. Do you think that the ruling party will eventually remove her by force? What scenarios are we looking at?
It's an interesting situation. I think we're even past this date. Well, her term, I think, has expired on 14th of December. And indeed, the ruling party probably has the levers and control over security forces and like to declare her former president, to create a new president and elect a new president and install him or her in the presidential palace. And there will be probably a clash between two presidents claiming legibility and probably a clash between supporters of Salome Zurabishvili and the new president-elect. So most likely there will be an escalation of the tensions and probably violence in Tbilisi.
All right, so it does seem like the turmoil in Georgia is far from over. Thank you so much for helping us round up all these different topics. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Thanks. And thank you for watching this edition of World News Tonight. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.